For more than 3 decades, Johnny Carson sat behind that desk with the calm authority of a man who seemed impossible to rattle. Night after night, America trusted him to make sense of chaos, to turn nerves into laughter, and to protect the illusion that everything was under control. But even Carson had moments when his composure was tested the second a guest stepped through the blue curtain. According to those who worked closest to him, Johnny could tell instantly when something was wrong. When a smile was too loose, a gaze too unfocused, a body moving at a different rhythm. And when that happened, the burden fell on him alone to keep the show from falling apart. The blue curtain and the secret system. The Tonight Show was sold to the public as routine. Johnny Carson walked out, delivered his monologue, took his seat, and welcomed America into a familiar half-hour that felt safe and predictable. But behind that reliability lived a quieter truth that few viewers ever understood. Backstage, especially during the 70s, chaos was never far away. Celebrities didn't always arrive clear-headed. Some arrived drunk, others stoned, some coked up, and occasionally far worse. Former producers have said Johnny Carson possessed what they called a sixth sense. He didn't need confirmation from staff. He knew the moment a guest walked toward him. Within seconds, he could tell whether someone was sober enough to function or whether the night was about to become a rescue operation. His eyes would narrow slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, as he adjusted his approach in real time. To manage these moments, the show developed an internal language that never reached the audience. Production assistants were trained to watch body language. Segment producers stood ready with backup plans. And Johnny himself used silent signals. If he touched his tie while introducing a guest, it meant the person sitting across from him was not fully sober. If he straightened his cards twice on the desk, it was a warning to simplify the show immediately. Fewer camera moves, shorter answers, and be ready to cut away without hesitation. This system wasn't designed to humiliate anyone. It existed to protect the broadcast, and in many cases, to protect the guest. The pressure of The Tonight Show was immense. A good appearance could change a career overnight. A bad one could follow someone for years. Unlike modern talk shows, Carson wanted spontaneous conversation. That terrified many performers. To cope, they turned to alcohol, pills, marijuana, or cocaine, often supplied long before they reached the studio. The green room became a pressure cooker. The bar was always stocked. One drink was unofficially tolerated. Two raised concern. Anything beyond that depended on the star involved and how much control they could maintain. Johnny himself drank off camera, but he never lost control on air. That contrast made moments of impairment across the desk even more dangerous. Carson did not moralize. He did not lecture. His only question was whether the guest could deliver. If they could, he guided them gently. If they couldn't, he shifted into containment mode. That balancing act would be tested repeatedly, starting with a man who turned being visibly stoned into part of his public identity. George Carlin. Functional, brilliant, and untrusted. George Carlin appeared on The Tonight Show more than 100 times, becoming one of Johnny Carson's most reliable guests and one of the most recognizable figures in American comedy. By the early 70s, Carlin had fully transformed himself from a clean-cut performer into a counterculture voice. His hair grew long, his material sharpened, and his relationship with marijuana became an open secret. Crew members remembered him as calm, loose, and unmistakably altered. A longtime camera operator once said Carlin riffed like a genius and grinned like a stoner, noting that the slightly glazed look in his eyes was practically part of the package by then. Carlin wasn't hiding anything. He didn't need to. Audiences accepted it, and Carson understood exactly who he was dealing with. What separated Carlin from many others on this list was functionality. He showed up prepared. He was sharp. His timing never failed. The weed didn't derail him. It seemed to fuel his philosophical monologues and free-flowing ideas. Carson adapted accordingly, asking open-ended questions and then stepping back, allowing Carlin to wander verbally into places few comedians could reach. Yet despite this trust, there was a boundary Carson never crossed. George Carlin was never chosen as a guest host. Other comedians with fewer appearances and less cultural impact were given that responsibility. The reason, according to former writers, came down to reliability. Running the show required precision, timing, and absolute control for 90 minutes. Carson respected Carlin's brilliance, but he wasn't willing to risk the entire operation. Years later, Carlin himself confirmed what everyone already knew. In his autobiography, he wrote plainly that yes, he was usually stoned during his Carson appearances in the 70s. There was no shame in the admission. It was presented as context. As he put it, it was the era, and it was who he was. Carlin represents the most benign version of chemical enhancement on The Tonight Show, a man altered, but in control. That balance, however, was rare, and when substances tipped from enhancement into volatility, Johnny Carson's job became far darker. Richard Pryor, genius on the edge of collapse. If George Carlin represented control, Richard Pryor represented danger, not because he lacked talent, but because his brilliance lived too close to self-destruction. Pryor was one of the most electrifying comedians ever to sit across from Johnny Carson, but by the late 70s, his appearances carried an unmistakable tension. Crew members said he could be hilarious one moment and mentally drift away the next, as if something inside him suddenly disconnected. One appearance in the late 70s became quietly infamous among staff. Pryor began talking about his childhood, then slowly lost the thread of his own story. His sentences dissolved into fragments. His eyes changed. The audience laughed, unsure whether this was part of the act. Johnny Carson knew better. According to people in the control room, Carson immediately shifted into what they called protection mode. Rather than exposing Pryor's vulnerability, Carson worked to stabilize the conversation. He jumped in with gentle redirections, cracked small jokes to reset the rhythm, and shortened the segment without calling attention to it. To the audience, it looked effortless. Backstage, it was emergency management. Pryor's cocaine use was becoming increasingly serious during this period. Insiders watched the progression unfold in real time. Some nights he was razor sharp, other nights barely anchored. Carson never mocked him, he never challenged him, and he never treated Pryor like a spectacle. Instead, he adjusted the environment to meet Pryor where he was. Former NBC executives later said Carson genuinely worried about Pryor, not as a moral authority, but as someone who recognized genius burning itself too fast. After certain erratic appearances, Carson reportedly checked in through mutual friends, quietly asking how Pryor was holding up. That concern never crossed onto the air because Carson believed his job was to preserve dignity even when a guest could not fully protect themselves. Pryor's appearances illustrate Carson's most compassionate instinct. As long as the guest remained non-threatening and partially functional, Johnny would do everything in his power to guide them safely through. But that tolerance had limits. Limits that were crossed in spectacular fashion by a man America never expected to see unravel on late-night television. Truman Capote and Cheech and Chong, where the line was drawn. Truman Capote was not a comedian, not a rock star, and not a counterculture rebel. He was a literary icon, which made his disastrous appearance all the more unsettling. When Capote walked on to The Tonight Show near the end of the 70s, crew members immediately knew something was wrong. He was slurring so badly that even seasoned technicians struggled to understand him. His head dipped forward repeatedly, then snapped upright with a startled expression, as if he were waking up mid-sentence. Johnny Carson tried to save the segment. He simplified questions. He slowed the pace, but nothing worked. Capote was barely present. The control room panicked. Carson's smile tightened. The audience sensed something was off, but couldn't quite place it. When the show cut to commercial, Carson reportedly stormed backstage and made his position clear. Capote would never be invited back. This was not about substance use alone. It was about non-functionality. Carson tolerated impairment. He did not tolerate a guest who could not participate at all. Capote became one of the few people to receive a lifetime ban from The Tonight Show. That same era also featured guests who sat on the opposite end of the spectrum. Cheech and Chong never pretended to be sober. Their relationship with cannabis was public, unapologetic, and woven directly into their comedy. Carson recognized that immediately and adjusted his role. Instead of steering them away from their state, he leaned into contrast, playing the straight man who pretended not to understand their references. This honesty created some of the most memorable segments of the period. Carson was effectively telling the audience, without saying it outright, that these men were exactly who they appeared to be. There was mutual respect. They delivered. They stayed professional. And most importantly, they didn't lose control. The difference between Capote and Cheech and Chong defined Carson's philosophy. It was never about substances themselves. It was about whether the guest could still honor the unspoken contract of television. Peter Fonda and Oliver Reed, when control was lost. By the early 70s, the line between counterculture and mainstream television had already begun to blur. Few appearances captured that collision more clearly than Peter Fonda's visit. Fonda was a symbol of rebellion, openly associated with psychedelics and alternative consciousness. When he arrived for his scheduled interview, staff immediately suspected something stronger than nerves was at play. From the moment the conversation began, Fonda seemed detached from time itself. He struggled to follow basic questions, drifting into long reflections about consciousness, time travel, and what he described as riding a cosmic wave that connected all things. His focus came and went. Crew members later said his pupils were abnormally dilated, and he appeared to be tuning in and out of reality. Johnny Carson responded with restraint. He reduced his questions to the simplest form possible and kept the tone neutral, but the interview continued to unravel. When Fonda began drifting again, Carson gave the silent emergency signal. Only minutes into what was supposed to be a full segment, the show cut away. When it returned, Fonda was gone. No explanation was offered. Carson simply moved on. Carson was not angry afterward. According to those present, he treated it as a practical problem rather than a moral one. Fonda would eventually return for later appearances in better condition, a sign that Carson believed in second chances, as long as safety and professionalism were restored. Oliver Reed, however, would not receive the same grace. When the British actor appeared, intoxication was obvious from the start. His responses were slurred but manageable at first. Then his behavior escalated. He interrupted Carson repeatedly, raised his voice, and eventually began demonstrating fighting stances on set. At that moment, the atmosphere shifted from awkward to dangerous. Carson's tolerance ended instantly. He cut the segment short, took control of the conversation, and ensured Reed was never invited back. Carson had a strict boundary. Substance use was one thing, aggression was another. Reed crossed that line, and the consequences were permanent. Sammy Davis Jeter and Johnny Carson's 3 rules. Not every chemically altered appearance ended in chaos. Sammy Davis Jr.'s interview in the mid-70s became legendary not for collapse, but for intensity. He spoke rapidly, shifted topics without pause, and seemed unable to sit still. His energy filled the room. Some viewers saw enthusiasm. Insiders saw something else. Staff members quietly recognized the signs of cocaine use that had become common in entertainment circles. Davis was sweating under the lights, his eyes constantly moving, his thoughts racing ahead of his own words. And yet, unlike others, he never lost control. He delivered stories. He hit punchlines. He remained charming, focused, and professional. Carson adapted by letting Davis run, gently guiding him when necessary but never interrupting his flow. Afterward, Carson reportedly joked to staff that the interview left him exhausted, but he never criticized Davis publicly or privately. Davis had stayed within the boundaries. That boundary defined Carson's entire approach. He did not care what a guest did before walking on stage. He cared only about what happened once the conversation began. Over time, his staff came to understand that Carson lived by 3 unbreakable rules. Do not threaten anyone. Do not disrespect the audience. Do not waste airtime. Guests like George Carlin and Cheech and Chong bent expectations but delivered. Richard Pryor struggled, but remained non-threatening and brilliant. Sammy Davis Jr. pushed the limits of energy but stayed in control. Capote and Reed crossed into non-functionality and aggression. That was where Carson drew the line. Carson never humiliated impaired guests. He shielded them when possible and cut them loose only when necessary. In doing so, he preserved the dignity of the show and the people who trusted him with their careers. So which of these Tonight Show moments shocked you the most? Do you think Johnny Carson was protecting his guests or protecting television itself? If you enjoy uncovering these untold Hollywood stories, don't forget to subscribe to Old Hollywood Pulse. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.